Good morning, Skyhawks. Welcome to our annual Veterans Day Assembly. Today we have an amazing speaker who will talk to us about his experiences during World War II. Even though it's virtual, we ask that you remain respectful by keeping off your phones and paying attention to what our speaker has to say. That being said, sit back, relax, and enjoy the assembly.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Well, my name is James Dollar. I'm a U.S. Army veteran, and I served from 1990 to 2016. Well, Veterans Day originally came out of World War I. America had lost 116,000 men in that conflict. This is war on a scale that had not been seen by the rest of the world ever. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the armistice was signed that ended hostilities in Europe. A year later, on the anniversary, President Woodrow Wilson declared that there would be Armistice Day, and that we would remember the sacrifices of the men that served and their bravery and appreciate the victory. This was done with parades and ceremonies, and there was a 2-minute cessation of business at 11 a.m. In 1926, the Congress decided that they would make a formal declaration. It was not just a celebration of the soldiers that served in World War I, it was a celebration of peace, and it was actually a peace holiday. Of course, it was a little early because in 1939, World War II began. And in 1954, President Eisenhower, in order to recognize the service of all those who served in World War II and Korea, changed it to Veterans Day. The last addition to it was in 2016, President Obama signed a Veterans Day moment of silence, so that at 3:11 in the afternoon, there's supposed to be a 2-minute of silence recognized by the United States people. Here in America, we are blessed with prosperity and freedom, but what we are often short of is gratitude. It's an opportunity to reach out and thank those people who guaranteed those safeties, that prosperity, and freedoms.
Our amazing speaker today is Mr. Keith Henry, who is going to talk to us about his experiences in World War II at the home front. Keith Henry is a self-made man who started as a farmer and went on to be an aeronautic engineer. Keith's favorite candy is Snickers, and he likes to eat at least one bite a day. He is 96 years old and has been married to his beautiful wife for almost 75 years. Now please give your full attention to the man of honor, Keith Henry.
Good morning or good afternoon, whichever applies. My name is Keith Henry, Keith Larson Henry. I was born about 96 years ago, a little more than that, on September the 11th, 1924, back in Gunnison, Utah. And today I would like to tell you a little bit about the situation back as I grew up in Gunnison in those years that followed my birth. I'm now in high school, and I'm a junior in high school, and World War II is starting to really become a big issue. Germany had attacked and declared war on France and England and Poland, and war was going on over there. And the United States was supplying France and England with airplanes and with other supplies to further their effort in the war. I might say at this point that Because of the war situation, gasoline became rationed, meat became rationed. The country was no longer making cars like they used to. The production lines in Ford and General Motors, for example, switched from cars to tanks to Jeeps, military type equipment. So clearly the nation was on a footing of let's win the war. Everybody was involved. Everybody, in fact, a lot of the young men in high school who were not quite 18 of age would get their parents to sign a waiver so they could join the service and get involved. The nation, the entire nation, became involved in the effort to win the war. There was a movement needed more money, and so U.S. saving bonds were started. So if you had any extra money, you could buy a saving bond, and that money would be used to buy tanks and airplanes, things like that, to be used in the war. But on December the 7th in 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Now, I'm a junior in high school at that time, and as I recall today, my feelings at that point, I really don't remember too much in a dramatic way of that bombing. But I do remember that soon after the bombing, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States at that time, declared over the radio, we didn't have TV at that time, but he declared over the radio to the nation that we had been bombed and that we were declaring war on Japan. So now, and soon after that, the United States declared war on Germany. So now I'm a junior in high school, and the nation is involved in World War II. And I proceeded through high school and graduated, and I'm now 17 years old. And at that time, the government, the United States government, had established, because of the war effort, they had established draft boards, and everybody that was over the age of 18 had to register with the draft board. And the reason for the draft board was to pull people from civilian life into military life as needed in the Army, the Navy, the Coast Guard, wherever the need was there. And so I didn't need to register when I came out of high school because I was only 17. And so I went up to Utah State. I had earned a scholarship at Utah State, so I was now up at Utah State when I turned 18. Well, I got a letter from the draft board that said, you need to register and so forth. And so I did that, but I knew that if I left it up to the draft board as to where I went into military service, that I had really no control over it. And I had loved, as a kid in high school and earlier, I had loved airplanes. I had built many model airplanes, and I just loved airplanes and had a strong interest in flying. So when the draft board said, you got to register, I decided that I would go join the Army Air Corps in their pilot training program. When the draft board came to you to register you were, as I recall, there was no military or physical examination required. But if you, let's say you had had an arm that was not usable, or maybe you had lost an eye, maybe you had some physical problem, they would classify you as 4F. That meant you had a military disability and you were not eligible for military service. Also, there were farms in Gunnison, and if a young man was needed on the farm, there could be a deferment because of the need for farming. And so maybe he didn't have to be considered for military service because his duty was back on the farm. But that deferment was hard to get. And another situation I might tell you about is that as the effort proceeded, the military effort proceeded in the United States, there were people needed in the Air Force, the Navy, whatever. But there was also a need for doctors and dentists. And so there were programs set up to train doctors and dentists. In fact, I had a good friend of mine, Bert Eggertson. He signed up in the Navy as a V-12 program, and he went into medical training. And when the war ended 3 or 4 years later, he was a full-fledged doctor. So some people came out as doctors, some people came out as pilots. Others, a lot of others were killed, of course, but all of that was going on during World War II. So I did that. And then, so in July the 3rd, as I recall, 1943, I joined the Army Air Corps. And it was not long after that, that I was on into military training. Well, now I'm in the Army Air Corps, and so I started my training. I went to Shepherd Field, Texas, and there I went through basic training. It was my first time away from Utah, so it was kind of a strange experience for me. And then I went to the University of Arkansas for pilot training. I was taught about navigation and Morse code and all those things that are needed in flying. And then I went to a aviation cadet center in San Antonio, Texas, where they, through an extensive physical and mental examination, they determined whether you would be a fighter pilot or a bomber pilot or a bombardier or a navigator. And I was selected then to be a twin-engine airplane pilot. So I went into training. I went into Pine Bluff, Texas for primary training, then up to Independence, Kansas for basic training, and then finally into advanced twin-engine flying training. And that was to be done at Pampa, Texas. When we arrived at Pampa, Texas, we learned that the military was running short of pilots. And they were, because of the way they had been conducting the training, pilots that trained in the twin-engine advanced at that point were being trained in smaller twin-engine airplanes like the UC-78 and the AT-11s and stuff like that from Beechcraft. And so they thought, well, then after they'd finished that, then if they went to a combat airplane like the B-25 that, or a B-17 or a B-24, that it took another 2 or 3 months to get them ready to go overseas and become part of the combat operations overseas. So they decided, when I came along in Class 44J, that they were going to eliminate the small airplanes in basic training and see if we as cadets could learn to fly the B-25. Now this is a model of the B-25. It's a modern medium-range bomber, twin-engine.
Bring it up.
And you can see a picture of it.
You got to bring it up by your
Okay,
face.
so
There
this is a picture of the B-25, the model of it. Anyway, so when we arrived at Pampa, Texas, the runways, the ramp was covered. There must have been 200, maybe not that many, maybe 100, brand new B-25s that we were going to fly, see if we could fly, and learn to fly in our advanced flight training. So we went to work, and within, I would say about 15 hours, something like that, we all had the B-25 mastered. And so we went on to complete our training with the B-25, and then they decided to hold our class for another month after we had finished the normal curriculum. And so we had another month flying the B-25. Following that, then we became second lieutenants, and were then sent on to new assignments. And we were all curious about where our new assignments would be, whether we would be assigned to B-24s, for example, or B-17s. Well, it turns out that they selected 10 of us out of that class to be flight instructors for the next class. So all of a sudden I became a flight instructor after just completing my advanced training. So now I'm a flight instructor, and my assignment took me to Eden, Oklahoma. And there for almost the next year, I was a flight instructor teaching students to fly the B-25. And after their training from there, they went on to the B-17s and the B-24s. So the way I got to overseas in a way is through my students. Well, anyway, so...
And how old were you at this point?
And I was 20 years old as a flight instructor flying the B-25s. And I loved it. I could fly that airplane. I knew it like the back of my hand. And at the end of each class ran about 3 months. I think I went through about 3 classes before the war ended. But this airplane became very prominent in World War II as a low-level strafer. It would come into areas where the railroads were located or petroleum farms, and they'd come in and bomb and strafe. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But isn't this the plane that actually dropped the
this airplane here was flown by,
is it flown by
Jimmy Doolittle.
Right.
And there's a movie, the 40 seconds over Tokyo or something like that.
Well, and they showed on Midway too, the movie Midway.
Yes, there's
a little clip,
but not the B-25 on Midway.
Right. Okay.
But in the early part of the war, it was not going very well. The Japan forces were just dominating, and Germany was still going quite strong. But the issue was now, in this case, with Japan, and Roosevelt struggled with a way to build the morale in the United States and kind of show Japan, we're strong enough to hit you back a little bit. Mm-hmm. So they came up with the idea of taking, I think it was 17 B-25s, like this airplane, and put them on an aircraft carrier. And we had learned with the airplane that the airplane can take off quite quickly on short fields. It was good for a short field takeoff.
There you go, show it. There,
Yeah.
Here it is. If you hold it up by your face.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like that? Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
you can
they decided that if they could get close enough to Japan, they could take the B-25s off and go into Japan and bomb the mainland, Tokyo, and the other facilities surrounding the islands there, and then go on to China and land in China. And so Jimmy Doolittle was selected to lead this operation, and he took selected people. This was before my time. Mm-hmm. This was before I became involved with the B-25s. But they took off. They went in and bombed Japan, and they were discovered a little bit early. They wanted to get a little bit closer before they decided they had to take off, since they were being discovered. And so as they left the aircraft carrier, they had maybe 200 more miles to fly before getting to Japan than they had really planned on. And what that meant is that when they left Japan, went into China, they had less fuel, couldn't go quite as far into China. And so they did, and they did a good job. They bombed Japan, and Japan couldn't believe that we would do that, but we did. But it's interesting to follow those pilots. Some of them didn't get to China. Some of them had to bail out before they got to China, and they ran out of fuel and bailed out. And there's a lot been written about that particular flight. But I think there were only 3 of them killed, and they recovered all those pilots and got them back to the United States. But I also understand that when the Chinese would find these pilots that had bailed out and were trying to protect them, and the Japanese, if they caught them, they would kill the Chinese by the hundreds because of their protection and the care they gave to the U.S. pilots that did the bombing. Anyway, in my case, kind of an interesting story, in Gunnison, which is really kind of a farming community, on the west side of the valley, there were 3 very good farms over there that were owned and operated by 3 Japanese families. And when I went through high school, I had a good friend, Tom Kimura, who had grandparents in Japan. And those grandparents came over to visit with the family in Utah. And the kids would go to Japan to visit the grandparents. And when Japan attacked at Pearl Harbor, the attitude against the Japanese people just worsened very dramatically. And so the people in the Gunnison area became hostile to the Japanese people. And it turns out just before Pearl Harbor that Tom, my friend Tom, had gone to Japan to visit his grandparents. So I never did see Tom again. And it's my thought that maybe he stayed and he flew or participated in the Japanese forces against the U.S. But back to Gunnison, the attitude against the Japanese was not good. In fact, the FBI, in Gunnison there was a big sugar factory. It was very dominant. We raised a lot of sugar beets. And the FBI suspected that the Japanese, and I don't know how they got a clue on this, that the Japanese people there in the Gunnison area could be interested in blowing up or destroying the sugar factory. And so there was a suspicion there. I remember that. And I understood they did find some evidence of it. But because of this, there was really an absence of trust with the Japanese. In fact, I remember at the post office in Gunnison, when the Japanese people would come in to get their mail, I remember the postmaster, Fred Jones, would take their mail out on the street and throw it on the sidewalk and say, "There's your damn mail." And so it wasn't long after that, as you probably know, that the U.S. military and civilian operations before World War II gathered up most of the Japanese and put them into internment camps so that they could stay away and not be a danger to the war effort in the United States. And so, in my mind, as I reflect back on that situation, I can really understand why and how and the purpose for sending those Japanese to internment camps. But I will admit that there were some of those Japanese people that joined the military and fought. They were part of the military forces of the United States. So there's 2 sides of that argument. But anyway, it did happen. It's part of history. So, but it's interesting to note the patriotism of the citizens of the United States. But at the end of each class, there were 2 or 3 days while we sat around waiting for the new class to come in, and we were given permission to take the airplanes wherever we wanted to go. And so, me being from Utah, and there were 2 other instructors there with me that were from Utah, and we would come back to Utah in B-25s. And I remember on one occasion we came back and we were coming through the Grand Canyon area, and we were flying along at about 200 feet off the ground, and all of a sudden the Grand Canyon opened up over us. And so we dropped down into the canyon and saw all of that and then up into Utah. But the interesting thing about doing this is that we took with us our students. And my 4 students in the 3 classes I taught had never been west of the Mississippi River. They had never seen the Grand Canyon. They had never seen mountains, and that was all new to them. So on one occasion, on several occasions, I would come back to Gunnison, and I would pass over Gunnison at about 50 feet, and I had a good time buzzing Gunnison. And another time, the 3 of us, 3 B-25s, we came into Fish Lake, lowered ourselves just off the water, and went up to one side, the east side, and came back by Skull Guards, and back over the mountain, back into Gunnison. I did that several times, and so I've had a lot of fun doing that. And then we'd go up and land at the Hill Field and stay there for a day or 2, and the folks would come up and pick me up, and I'd come back to Gunnison for a day and then fly back to Enid. So I remember on one occasion, my little brother, Larry, knew I'd called Mom and Dad and told them I was coming. And I told him I'd be there around noon, as I recall. So he had gone out on one of the outbuildings out back and got up on top and sat there. And Mom said he sat there for probably 2 or 3 hours waiting for me to come by. But I did come by, and he was there. And I remember another thing we did. We would throw out 2 or 3 rolls of toilet paper, and when you throw out a roll of toilet paper, you know, let's say you're at 500 feet when you throw it out, it unrolls as a big ribbon as it unrolls. So, and I remember on one occasion there was an older couple in Gunnison who became fearful and thought, well, we're being bombed by the Germans. And they tried to call Hill Field to let them know that there was an airplane flying over Gunnison that's going to bomb them. And so the telephone operator, who was a good friend of mine, would not let the call go through. But I learned later they were concerned the Germans were bombing us. And as the war started to get to the end, Germany had surrendered, and I started pushing my squadron commander to let me go overseas. I was anxious to go overseas to get involved away from the flight instructing. I enjoyed flight instructing, but I was anxious for something more active. And so I got permission to go to an A-26 unit. And so on my delay en route, I'll be darned if the war didn't end. And so when the war ended, when Japan surrendered, all propellers came to a stop. All airplanes came to a stop. And it wasn't but 2 weeks after that I was sent to Lowry Field in Denver, Colorado, and I was just discharged and then went back to Gunnison. And there I went. And that concluded my effort in World War II. I stayed with the Air Force Reserve, and a few years later, I did some training up at Hill Field, and we were flying AT-6s. But that really ended my flying career. When I came out of the Air Force, I had about 1,000 hours, and there'd be 25, and I loved the airplane. So that one wound up.
I think talk about the patriotism and the unity of the country, like just the patriotism.
Well, as I mentioned early on, everybody wanted to join in and get involved in the
war
effort to fight Germany and Japan.
Right, the young men wanted to enlist.
What I'd like to say to you students here at the high school is that the United States is worth fighting for. It's worth doing the right thing for, and be involved politically for good things. Support the military. Help the United States stay strong, because if we're strong militarily, the world respects us, and we're not out to defeat anybody or to capture anybody or to kill anybody. We're here to defend liberty, so that we all might live peacefully and enjoy our days. So I encourage all you students to get involved. And I've got a grandson that's in the military right now. He's a pilot in the Marines, and he's enjoyed a wonderful training program. And so there's very good options in the military if you're so inclined. And the military will support medical education and so forth. So you need to search these things out so you can benefit from some of these programs. So I encourage you to do it. And from my point of view, World War II and all that I did there was a great experience for me.
Thanks for watching Skyhawks. I hope you learned something about Veterans Day that you didn't know before, and wait for you to go back to your class and have a good rest of your day.